This story's quiet, but it cuts deep. Told under lantern light in a cabin where two souls tried to unlearn the pain. In a world where justice wore no badge and love had no language. It began with a touch that lingered too long. Soft, but enough to spark a war within at Ashen Vows. Before we kick off this adventure, don't forget to hit like on the video and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. The story opens on a truth few people like to face. The quiet difference between being alone and being forgotten. Sometimes a person doesn't notice when the bars go up. They're built slowly from duty, habit, and endurance. And every now and then, it takes a violent force of nature to rip those bars apart. The year was 1871. The place was the Arizona Territory, land so harsh it felt as if God had shaped it in anger. Red earth stretched endlessly beneath a sky burned hard and blue. In that wasteland sat a lone trading post whose name sounded less like a town and more like a verdict. Solitude. And in solitude lived a woman named Clara Hale. Clara was 32 years old. Out here where sun and wind carved a person's face before youth had a chance to fade, that age carried weight. It marked her as finished, past her season. A widow. She had buried her husband 5 years earlier, a man she respected, but never truly knew. He spoke little, offered less warmth, and when he died, he left behind a narrow cabin, a few shelves of medical books, and a silence that settled into the rooms like unshaken dust. Clara served the town as its healer and midwife. She was the one summoned when a child burned with fever or when a ranch hand was crushed beneath a horse's kick. She was relied upon, even respected, but she was not noticed. To the people of solitude, Clara Hale blended into the background, like the water pump, like the hitching rail, useful, solid, and on this particular day, completely invisible. Heat pressed down on the town like a physical burden. Tin roofs shimmered. The packed earth breathed waves of distortion into the air. Inside her small clinic, Clara stood at the window, grinding dried sage with practiced hands. The scrape of the pestle echoed steadily, soft, rhythmic, alone. Outside, the wind began to change. It wasn't the familiar desert breeze. The sound was lower, sadder, like a mournful fiddle played by something long dead. It whispered against the glass, carrying the sharp scent of ozone and scorched earth. Clara's hand stilled. That old instinct, older than reason, tightened along her spine. The one that warns when the world is about to break. She looked toward the horizon. Normally, the land ended in a clean line where red met blue. Today, that line was gone. In its place rose a living wall, towering, rolling copper and amber, climbing from ground to sky. A dust storm, and not a small one. The town bell began to clang wildly, its frantic cry swallowed by the growing wind. Men shouted in the street, pulling bandanas over their faces, racing to bar shutters and drive livestock into shelter. Clara moved on instinct. Herbs were sealed away. Windows latched tight. She didn't feel fear. Fear required the belief that something precious could still be taken. Clara had long stopped believing that. Resignation settled in as the storm hit solitude full force. Bright noon crushed into choking twilight, then darkness. But this was no ordinary storm. Through the roar, she heard sounds that didn't belong. Not wood slamming or glass rattling, but rifle cracks. A horse screaming in terror. And then something far worse. Sharp, trilling war cries slicing through the wind. Cold seized her blood. Clara grabbed her medical bag without thinking, duty overtaking survival, and stepped toward the front door, peering into the swirling dust as the world outside collapsed into chaos. The world outside had turned to fire and dust, an orange hell of grit so thick she could barely see 10 feet ahead. Shadows moved through the storm, flickering in and out like ghosts. They weren't Comanche, that much Clara Hale knew. These men bore no bright feathers, no ceremonial colors. Instead, they were painted in muted ochres and streaks of charcoal, silent, deliberate, like smoke rising from a battlefield. The high mesa runners. They moved through solitude without shouting, without cruelty, just grim, terrifying precision. Clara should have locked her door, should have crouched behind her cot and waited for it all to pass. But then she saw him. Ben Carter, the town blacksmith, barely more than a boy, stumbled into the open, clutching his leg, blood soaked through his trousers, dark and fast. He dropped face first into the dirt, groaning for help no one would give. No one, except Clara. She didn't think. She flung her door open and ran straight into the wind. It hit her like a wall of sandpaper, burning her eyes, drying her mouth with the taste of metal and fear. But she pushed forward. She dropped to her knees beside Ben, her voice barely carrying over the roar. "Stay down," she shouted, hands already pressing into the wound. "I've got you." She never saw the man behind her. A gasp tore from her throat as she spun. He was right there, a warrior, his face streaked in jagged lines of white and black. He held a club raised high, breath heavy with adrenaline. His eyes didn't see her as a woman, not even as a person. She was just in his way. Clara froze. She didn't scream, just shut her eyes tight, bracing for the end. So this is how it ends. Alone in the dirt. But the strike never came. Instead, a voice broke through the storm. Deep, guttural, sharp like a blade. A single word in a language she didn't understand, but felt all the same. "Stop." She opened her eyes. The young warrior stood frozen, staring past her now. The rage in him had vanished, replaced with something close to reverence. Clara turned slowly to follow his gaze. And that was when she saw him. A giant stallion loomed in the dust, black as coal. Upon it sat a man carved from muscle and memory, his chest bare, skin mapped with old scars. His braids hung long, streaked with silver at the temples. He didn't move, didn't flinch. While the world twisted in chaos, he was still, commanding. But it was his eyes that made Clara forget how to breathe. Storm gray, piercing, alive with purpose. He scanned the scene like a hawk, saw her blood-stained dress, her hands trying to stop the bleeding, the healer's satchel scattered in the dirt. He saw her, truly saw her. Most men looked right through Clara Hale. Saw a widow, a shadow, a fixture. Not this man, not Cairo. He didn't look through her. He looked at her. Cairo studied Clara with a sharp, intelligent stillness that sent a flush of heat up her neck, heat that had nothing to do with the sun or the storm. Then he barked a command, short, clipped, unquestionable. The younger warrior lowered his club. Without a word, he stepped forward, gripped Clara's arm, and hauled her up from the dirt. "No," she cried out, twisting free, her hands still streaked with Ben Carter's blood. "He needs help. Let me." But the older warrior, the one they followed, was already off his horse. He moved with the kind of grace that didn't belong to a man his size, his boots landing silent in the dust. The other raiders stepped aside without a word, parting for him like he carried the weight of the storm itself. He stopped just inches in front of her. Up close, he smelled of sage smoke, leather, and rain-slick stone. Clara braced, waiting for pain, but his hand, broad, rough with callus, only lifted her chin. His thumb swept dust from her cheek, not with tenderness, but with precision, like he was evaluating her for something she didn't understand. There was no malice in that touch, no cruelty, only cold, practiced judgment. "He lives," Cairo said at last, voice low and gravel-thick, his English shaped by another tongue. "Or he dies by his strength alone." Clara's throat tightened. "I can't leave," she stammered, chest heaving like a bird against a cage. "I'm the healer here." His mouth twitched, just a flicker, not a smile. Something more dangerous, something knowing. "Healer?" he repeated slowly, testing the word like a blade. Then he looked at her blood-stained hands once more. "Then you are worth more than gold." He didn't ask permission. He didn't need it. In one fluid motion, he swept her off the ground. The world spun. For a moment, she was weightless. Then she was pressed against the solid heat of his chest, her heart pounding against the steady thud of his. Cairo lifted her onto the back of his horse and climbed up behind her. His arms circled her waist, not like a man holding a woman, but like a chain locking tight. Not comfort, control, a cage made of flesh and will. The stallion lunged forward into the storm, hooves pounding through the dust, and solitude vanished behind them like it had never been. Clara's pulse thundered in her ears. For 32 years, she had lived inside the lines, safe, proper, obedient. A good woman, a quiet one. She had learned how to disappear in plain sight. But now, with her back against the chest of a man who was war and wilderness wrapped in silence, something terrifying stirred deep inside her. She was a captive. She was alone, in danger, and helpless. But as the last rooftop of solitude disappeared into the storm, Clara Hale realized something that made her heart ache with confusion. For the first time in her life, she wasn't invisible. Clara Hale understood something in that moment, something that hit harder than any blow could have. She wasn't invisible anymore. The man who held her, this warrior with the storm in his eyes, he called himself Cairo. They called him the Bear, and he was taking her beyond the edge of the known world, into the high mesas, to a place where maps ended and truths began. The wind screamed around them as they rode, wild and unrelenting. But Clara didn't shut her eyes. Not this time. She watched the world shift, colors of blood and flame tearing through dust and light. And for the first time in her life, she wondered, who will I become when the storm settles? The dust didn't last forever. But when it passed, silence fell heavy as lead. They rode for hours, leaving behind everything she'd known. The stores, the churches, the clapboard porches, and town gossip, all of it swallowed by distance and memory. What replaced it was something otherworldly, a new landscape, foreign, vast, and ancient. Canyon country. The flatlands gave way to a maze of towering cliffs and deep red ravines, stone formations stacked high like forgotten cathedrals. Here the sun wasn't just light, it was punishment. It hammered the rock until the air itself seemed to waver and burn. Clara sat behind Cairo, her body screaming with exhaustion. No saddle, no rest. Her legs strained to grip the horse's flanks as each jolt ran up her spine. But the real torment wasn't the ache in her muscles. It was the closeness. Her body pressed against his, her arms pinned between them. She could feel the flex and shift of every move he made, the pull of reins, the steady pulse of his heart against her back. He smelled of leather, of sweat and smoke, and something sharper, wild like pine pitch or gun oil. Whenever the trail dipped into shadow or veered near a cliff's edge, his arm would tighten around her waist without thought. An instinct, not a kindness. Strong, unyielding, a reminder she wasn't riding free. She was being taken. She kept her eyes ahead, jaw clenched, waiting for the violence she had read about, the bloodletting the papers whispered of. She imagined a shallow grave, a canyon with no name, but it never came. There was no cruelty, no threats, just riding and silence. As dusk painted the sky in bruised shades of purple and indigo, the party finally began to slow. They rode down into a slender arroyo, narrow and carved by time. A thin stream glimmered through the rock, fed by some secret spring. The air here was cooler, heavy with the smell of sagebrush and damp stone. The high mesa runners dismounted, their breath ragged with fatigue, grunts and groans that were startlingly human. Cairo swung down from the stallion and turned to help Clara. Her legs had gone numb. When he pulled her free, they buckled under her. She collapsed forward and fell against him. He didn't shove her away. His hands caught her, broad and steady on her arms, keeping her upright just long enough for her to find her footing. Then, just as easily, he let go. Cairo's hands were large, steady, and rough, like they'd known both war and weather. He held Clara just long enough for her knees to stop shaking, then let her go without a word. He gestured toward a flat slab of rock near the water's edge. "Sit," he said. Clara obeyed, slow and wary. She wrapped her arms around herself, elbows tucked in, trying to fight the chill that had nothing to do with the air. Her wrists were still bound with the same leather thong they'd tied hours ago, now rubbed raw. Her skin burned where the edges had dug deep. Her throat was dry as tumbleweed. Fear crept back in. It slithered in like nightfall. Quiet, cold, and certain. She watched as the men moved about the narrow canyon, building a fire. She saw their long shadows stretch and twist against the walls as the sky darkened. Every motion, every breath, tightened the knot in her gut. She braced herself for the worst. Then she saw him again, Cairo, stepping out of the dark like a mountain casting its shadow. He stood tall over her, blocking out the first stars overhead. In his hand, he held a knife. The firelight danced on the blade, sharp, clean, lethal. Clara's breath caught in her chest. She turned her face away, eyes clamped shut, bracing for the pain. This is it, she thought. The end. But it didn't come. Instead, a sudden release. The sting of cold steel touched her wrist, and the leather thongs snapped free. No pain, just relief. Glorious, unexpected, confusing relief. She gasped and looked down, rubbing the red marks on her skin. Her wrists looked foreign to her, naked and bruised. When she looked up, Cairo wasn't watching her hands. He was reaching into a pouch at his belt. He pulled out a strip of cured venison, dark and lean. He didn't toss it at her like she was something to be fed. He didn't sneer or gesture. He broke the piece in half, handed her the thicker cut, and crouched low so they were eye to eye. For the first time, she noticed the wear in his features, the fine lines around his mouth, the exhaustion behind his storm-gray eyes. "Eat," he said simply. His voice was a low rumble, deep and calm. "You'll need strength." Clara hesitated, fingers trembling as she reached for the food. Her voice rasped through dry lips. "Why?" she asked. Why unbind me? Cairo didn't answer right away. He just stared into the fire, like he was weighing something heavier than words. Then his gaze met hers again. A woman can't eat with paws like a trapped wolf, he said, quiet but firm. And I don't starve what I keep. Then he rose, turned, and walked back to the others before she could say anything more. Clara sat there, alone, meat in her hand, heart pounding like a drum inside a canyon. I don't starve what I keep. Possessive. Yes. But there was something else in it, too. Something almost respectful. Practical. A strange kind of dignity wrapped in a dangerous truth. She chewed slowly, the meat tougher than boot leather, but tasted like life itself. Hunger hit her like a wave, and she didn't fight it. She hadn't realized how hollow she'd become. Clara Hale began to really see the men gathered around the fire. The terrifying shapes from the dust storm were gone now, softened by the flicker of flame and shadow. Their war paint had streaked down with sweat. These weren't the monsters the newspapers had warned about. Not bloodthirsty savages. No. What she saw was a young warrior chuckling under his breath as he fiddled with a busted stirrup. Another, older man sat beside his horse, gently rubbing salve into its leg, whispering something soft and comforting in a language not meant to scare. They were tired, their clothing patched and frayed from hard living. Their weapons, though cared for, had seen better days. Clara, who'd spent a lifetime in quiet observation, learning to read what went unspoken in people, understood something in that moment. These men weren't hunters. They were the hunted, not invaders, but fugitives. Men waging a war they knew they were losing, clinging to the final fringes of a world fading around them. Her eyes found Cairo again. He sat a little apart, back pressed against a rock, distant from the others. He wasn't eating. His eyes were shut tight, and a deep grimace etched across his face. One hand gripped his side. The fingers were wet, dark. Clara's chewing slowed to a stop as her gaze dropped lower. The leather at his ribs was stained black. Blood. Fresh and slow, bleeding through the tunic. The instinct hit her before reason did. The same instinct that had driven her into a dust storm to save Ben Carter. She was a healer. It wasn't just what she did. It was who she was. Logic screamed at her to stay seated. Let him bleed. Let nature make the escape for her. A quiet voice crept into her mind. If he weakens, you might run. He's the enemy. But Clara looked again, saw the way he sat, still and silent, unwilling to show pain to his men. And she made her decision. She stood. It was a small movement, but it sent a ripple through the camp. Two young warriors bolted upright, hands flashing to their knives. They barked something sharp in their native tongue, stepping in fast. Clara froze, heart slamming in her chest. But she didn't back down. Her eyes stayed fixed on Cairo. His eyes were open now, locked on hers. He didn't move, but his gaze held her like a tether. Clara lifted her hand slowly, fingers open to show she held nothing. Then she pointed to her own side, then to his. "You're bleeding," she said loud and clear. The firelight carried her words. One of the young men surged forward, gripping her arm to force her back down. "Stop," Cairo said. His voice was quiet, but it cracked through the night like thunder. The warrior froze mid-step. His eyes darted to Cairo, who gave a sharp nod. Let her through. The warrior let her go, his scowl deep, reluctant. But he stepped aside. Clara moved forward, every step heavier than the last. Her legs wobbled beneath her skirt, but her hands? Steady as stone. She knelt beside Cairo. Up close, the scent of blood hit her like a slap, raw, coppery, unrelenting. He was watching her, his body drawn tight like a mountain lion ready to pounce, muscles coiled and eyes unblinking. "May I?" she asked softly, fingers reaching toward the edge of his shirt. He said nothing. Just watched her, searching her face for a trace of fear or betrayal. He found neither. Then, just barely, he gave a nod. The kind a man gives when words cost too much. Clara pushed back the leather. What she saw made her breath hitch. The wound was jagged, old stitches torn loose during the fight. Angry, swollen, oozing blood like a bad memory refusing to fade. "This needs to be cleaned," she murmured, her voice slipping into the steady rhythm of a healer's tone. A mask, a shield for her shaking heart. "Do you have water?" "Whiskey," Cairo answered, handing over a worn water skin. She didn't hesitate, tore a strip from the hem of her petticoat. No ceremony, no fuss, just purpose. Grit. Then she touched him. The instant her cool fingers pressed against the fevered heat of his skin, the world around them ceased to exist. Cairo drew a sharp breath through his teeth, his abdomen clenched beneath her touch. Reflex. Instinct. Clara froze. Her gaze flew to his face, so close now she could see gold flecks buried in his gray eyes, could see the throb of his pulse in the hollow of his throat. The canyon held its breath. No fire crackled, no wind stirred, only silence stretched between them, thick, electric, brimming with something unspeakable. And in that silence, Cairo didn't see a captive, didn't see a burden or a debt or a danger. He saw her hands, her calm, her courage, and Clara, kneeling in the red dirt with blood on her fingers, felt something strike through her like lightning, something wilder than the raid, more terrifying than chains. She felt seen. "This will sting," she whispered, barely audible. "I've known pain," he replied, voice low, rough, a sound that rumbled through her chest. "Do what you must, healer." She nodded, focusing on the wound. She cleaned it, firm but gentle, and bound it tight. All the while, Cairo's gaze never left her, not once. When she finished tying the last knot and sat back, wiping her hands on the dirt, she realized the balance between them had shifted. The rope was gone, but something else had taken its place. A bond. A thread. She wasn't just the woman he had pulled from the storm anymore. And he wasn't just the savage who had taken her. Not under this sky. Not now. The canyon stars stared down, silent and cold. Something had shifted. A danger deeper than the desert wind had begun to take hold. If the desert had been a furnace, then the place Cairo brought her to was the breath of cool mercy. They had ridden through a crack in the earth, a jagged fissure in red rock, so narrow the horses scraped stone on either side. Clara had shut her eyes, thinking they were riding into a tomb. But when the walls finally opened, she didn't find darkness. She opened her eyes to green. A hidden box canyon stretched before her, cloaked by towering cliffs that kissed the sky. And in its belly, a miracle. A spring-fed creek, clear as glass, laughing softly over smooth stones. Cottonwood trees, old, thick, and mighty, reached high like cathedral spires, shaking gold and green leaves in the gentle wind. It was paradise, carved in silence. Clara had expected chains, a prison, But when Cairo lifted her down in the heart of the village, he didn't bind her. He didn't throw her to a cage. He led her to a small, solitary lodge, buffalo hide stretched over cedar poles, set apart near the song of the creek. "You sleep here," he said, voice low. "You're safe here." Then he walked away. For the first week, Clara lived in wary silence. She wasn't a prisoner, yet she couldn't leave. Not a guest, not a slave, just a ghost drifting on the edge of their world. The women watched her with narrowed eyes. They clutched their shawls tighter when she passed, pulled their children in close. To them, she was the enemy, the face of the world that had come to steal their land. Clara kept her head bowed. She swept the dust from her lodge. She scrubbed her dress at the creek until the cloth thinned. She waited for their wrath to rise. But it wasn't fury that came. It was the fever. It started with the smallest, a strange sickness carried on the shifting wind. It dried lips, dulled eyes, stole strength. The canyon hushed. Children's laughter gave way to the chants of Ashen, the medicine man, and the quiet weeping of mothers. Clara sat in her lodge, listening to sorrow. She knew those sounds, had heard them 100 times in the stillness of solitude. One morning, she saw Shaya, the woman with the sharpest, most mistrusting gaze, stagger from her lodge, face gray with grief. In her arms, she cradled a little girl. She couldn't have been more than 4. The child, Tala, lay limp in her mother's arms, tiny chest rising and falling in shallow, rasping gasps. Ashen, the medicine man, had shaken his rattles. He'd burned sage until smoke filled the lodge. But the fever clung tight, and the little girl's spirit was fading. Clara Hale didn't hesitate. She didn't stop to ask, didn't measure the risks. She simply took her satchel, the one Cairo had pulled from the wreckage of the storm, and crossed the open space toward Shaya's lodge. Shaya recoiled the moment Clara approached. She clutched Tala tighter, stepping back with a hiss. "Go!" She spat in broken English, eyes narrowed. White magic, bad. Clara stood her ground. She looked not at the mother, but at the child's burning face. Then met Shaya's stare, firm and unwavering. "It's not magic," Clara said evenly. "It's willow bark for the pain, and cool river water for the fire. Let me help her." Shaya's breath caught. She looked down at her daughter, flushed and barely conscious. Then at the white woman with open hands. And in that pause, something shifted. Because desperation, real, raw desperation, cuts deeper than fear. With a slow, pained motion, Shaya gave a single nod. For 3 long days and nights, Clara didn't sleep. She knelt beside the fire inside Shaya's lodge, bathing Tala's skin with cool river water. She brewed teas from willow bark and yarrow, coaxing the bitter liquid drop by drop past the child's cracked lips. She hummed lullabies, soft, wordless melodies from a life long gone, letting them rise gently into the smoke hole above. Cairo came once. He stood silent at the entrance, his tall frame filling the doorway. He said nothing, just watched, his expression hidden in the shadows. But in that moment he saw it all. Clara's weariness, her care, her refusal to give up. He gave a single nod, quiet, solemn, then slipped into the night. By the 4th morning, the fever broke. Tala's eyes fluttered open, clear and dark, and she asked for water. Shaya collapsed, sobbing against Clara's skirt, kissing her hands again and again. Everything changed. It was like a wall crumbling. Clara wasn't the outsider anymore. She was the woman who stood toe-to-toe with death and won. That evening, the women came. They didn't knock. They simply entered. They brought bowls of venison stew rich with wild onions. They laid down soft furs. Then, without a word, Shaya guided Clara onto a buffalo robe and gently began unpinning her hair. Clara's hair, plain dull brown, usually bound tight in a severe schoolteacher's bun, the mark of a woman forgotten by love. But tonight, that changed too. Clara sat still as Shaya gently combed through her hair with a carved bone comb. Her fingers moved in slow, rhythmic motions, untangling each knot with care. Then she began braiding it, deliberate, steady, working in narrow leather strips and small beads, styling Clara's hair the way their people had done for generations. It was more than a braid. It was a rite of belonging. Around the fire, the other women shared roasted corn and slices of dried meat. They laughed softly, speaking in a language Clara could barely grasp, but the warmth in their eyes needed no translation. Something stirred in her chest, a slow thaw in a heart that had been cold for far too long. She was 32 years old, and for the first time, she felt like she belonged, like she was no longer looking in from the outside. If the women offered her a place, it was Cairo who gave her purpose. His courtship wasn't like anything she had read in storybooks. There were no poetic declarations or wildflowers pressed between pages. No chasing or boasting, just quiet presence, patience, and meaning in every gesture. One morning, she woke to find a fresh rabbit hanging by the door of her lodge. Skinned, cleaned, a provider's gift, unspoken, but deeply understood. Days later, she discovered a comb resting atop a flat river rock where she always went to wash. It was carved from juniper wood, still fragrant with pine. The handle shaped like a hawk mid-flight, not a store trinket. It had taken hours, his hands working for hers. Then came the stone. She found it one evening on her pillow. A river stone, black and glass smooth, streaked with a single white stripe of quartz running clean through its center. Clara held it in her palm and knew without needing to ask. He'd found it in the water. He'd seen it and thought of her. Cairo never crossed the threshold uninvited, never touched her without permission. He simply remained nearby, orbiting like some massive, silent gravity. And she found herself leaning toward it, toward him. One evening, the wind carried the first bite of autumn. The village was hushed. Clara sat beside a small fire outside her lodge, wrapped in the wool blanket Shaya had given her. Footsteps approached, soft over dry leaves, and she didn't startle. She knew that walk now. Cairo stepped into the firelight. He didn't sit right away, just stood there, tall and still, his face half-shadowed in flickering flame. His eyes, usually stormy, were calm tonight. "The child ran today?" he said, voice low and gravel-edged. "She's strong," Clara answered, and her smile told him everything he needed to know. Clara kept her eyes on him, searching for something she couldn't quite name. All she needed was a foothold, to find that flicker of strength still buried inside her. Cairo gave a quiet nod. He lowered himself down, settling onto the earth nearby. Not too close, just close enough that the warmth of him reached her like a campfire against the coming dark. They didn't speak for a long while, but the silence wasn't stiff or uncertain anymore. It had shifted. It was steady, shared. Clara turned the polished stone in her hand, feeling its weight and cool surface. She drew in a slow breath, gathering the courage to ask the question that had burned inside her since the storm. "Cairo," she said softly. He turned his head, slowly, giving her his full attention. "Why?" she asked. "Why did you take me? Why did you save me? I was nothing to you, a stranger, maybe even an enemy." Cairo's gaze dropped to the fire. He picked up a twig, snapped it clean in half, and tossed the pieces into the flames. "I've seen many horses in my life," he said, voice low and steady. "Some are born wild. They run because that's all they've ever known. But others—" He paused. "Others are born in fences, in corrals, broken before anyone ever rides them. They stand quiet in the dust, heads low, waiting for the lash." Then he looked at her, and his eyes, dark and unflinching, cut through everything she had built to protect herself. "When I saw you in that storm," he said, "I saw a woman standing inside a corral. But her eyes, they were searching for a way out." Clara felt her breath catch in her chest. "I didn't save you, Clara." His voice dropped lower still. It was the first time he had spoken her name, and it came rough, reverent, like a prayer whispered into smoke. "I just saw a spirit that was already strong. I only brought it somewhere it could finally breathe." She looked at him, eyes burning. In solitude, her husband had looked at her and seen someone to clean his house. The townspeople had seen a midwife, and someone useful. But Cairo, he had seen her. She looked around the canyon, now darkening into twilight. Her eyes lingered on the lodge that was hers now, on the stone in her hand. And then, like being struck by something raw and undeniable, she realized she didn't miss solitude, not the ticking clock, not the quiet clinic, not the people who never truly saw her. She'd been surrounded by people, yet lonelier than ever. But here, in the wild, beside a man who'd barely touched her, she felt valued. She turned to Cairo again, and for the first time, she didn't see a man who had taken her. She saw the only man who had ever truly tried to find her. "I'm breathing," she whispered. "For the first time, I'm breathing." Cairo didn't smile, but something in his gaze gentled. He reached out, paused for just a moment, then placed his hand over hers, warm and steady, enfolding both her fingers and the stone she held. "Then breathe," he said. Under the watchful shade of the cottonwoods, in the stone-walled quiet of the canyon, something long smoldering finally caught flame. Peace, Clara Hale had come to understand, was a fragile, fleeting thing, like a soap bubble drifting over a patch of cactus, beautiful, iridescent, and doomed the moment the wind turned. For weeks now, their hidden canyon had become its own little world. The war outside, shifting borders, and loud-mouthed politicians in Washington felt like part of someone else's nightmare. Clara had fallen into the rhythm of the sun and moon, where calendars didn't matter and maps held no meaning. She forgot that men once drew lines on paper and spilled blood to defend them, but the world has a cruel way of hunting down the things that wish to remain hidden. And it found them on a Tuesday, or what Clara figured was a Tuesday. The air had the crispness of early fall, touched with the scent of turning leaves. She was down near the canyon's narrow river mouth, where two sheer red rock walls rose like silent sentinels. She was gathering willow branches, her basket on the sand nearby, humming a soft tune, part lullaby, part memory of him. Then the hush shattered, not wind, something heavier, iron striking stone, the dull, arrogant weight of shod hooves. Voices, loud, crude, unmistakably English. Clara froze. A willow twig snapped in her grip. She backed hard against the canyon wall, heart pounding in her ears. Through the gap in the stone, 3 riders came into view. Not cavalry. Soldiers wore order. These men wore greed. Prospectors. Their coats were slick with old grease, beards tangled, eyes fevered with that gleam that saw mountains not as sacred, but as something to devour. Pickaxes and shovels clattered from their pack mules. They were the kind who looked at land and saw only what could be stripped away. Strangers, trespassers. Clara held her breath, pressed into the rock's cold curve. Pass by, she begged silently. Just keep riding. But the man out front, a leathery brute with sun-scoured cheeks and old pock scars, reined in his mule. He sniffed the air, spotted the clear stream spilling from between the rocks, a miracle in this dry season. Well, he rasped, spitting a string of tobacco juice into the water. Would you look at that? Water means green, muttered the second man, drifting a hand toward the rifle at his side. Green means camp, might be hostiles. Or it might be gold. The leader grinned, and Clara Hale knew in her bones trouble had found them. The man's yellowed teeth flashed as they kicked their horses forward. They were coming straight at her. Clara Hale stepped back, her heel pressing into the dry gravel. The crunch echoed like a rifle shot through the stillness of the canyon. The lead rider's head jerked toward the sound. His eyes widened. For a moment, he just stared, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. A white woman in a deerskin dress, standing alone in a sacred canyon. My God, he muttered. It's a white woman. Hey, miss. His voice bounced off the red canyon walls. Clara didn't flinch. She stood firm, gripping the willow branches like they could shield her. Don't be scared, girl, the man called out, swinging off his saddle. His boots hit the earth, and he strode toward her, arms stretched wide like he meant to comfort her. But it looked more like a snare. We got you now. You're safe. We'll get you out of this hellhole. The word hung there, bitter and wrong. He didn't see her. He saw a story, a victim, something to brag about in a Tucson saloon for free drinks. He smelled like sweat and cheap whiskey, even 10 paces away. Clara looked past him. Up on the ridge, carved against the blazing blue sky, stood a figure. Cairo. Still as stone, bow in hand, arrow notched. He'd had plenty of chances to shoot. Could have dropped the man before his foot even touched sand. But he didn't. He hadn't come to kill. He was waiting, watching her. His bow dipped slightly, just enough to show her she was free to choose. It was a silent trial, a moment suspended between cliff and river. Do you want to go back, Clara? Here's your old world. Here are the men who call themselves your people. They came to drag you home. Clara turned to the prospector again. Come on, sweetheart, he coaxed, inching closer. His boots trampled the wildflowers she'd stopped to admire just that morning. Run to me. We'll wipe this place clean. Kill the rest of them and take you back where you belong. Clara thought of that empty cabin, of silence so heavy it rang in her bones, of being useful, but never truly seen, of living invisible. Then Clara felt the weight of the stone in her pocket. She remembered Tala's fever breaking. How Cairo had looked at her across the firelight, like she was every star in his sky and every root in his earth. And when she looked at the prospector, she didn't see a rescuer. she saw a thief. The fear that had gripped her chest vanished. In its place, something colder, stronger, anger, the kind of anger only a woman protecting her family could feel. She dropped the willow branches, stepped from the shadows, head high, shoulders squared. "Stop!" The word cracked through the air like a whip. The lead prospector froze, startled. "Miss, get out!" Clara shouted, her voice raw, fierce, echoing like a thunderclap against the rock walls. "There's nothing here for you. Leave." Confusion flickered in the man's eyes. Then came the sneer. "You've been brainwashed, lady. We ain't leaving you with these people." "I am where I belong," she screamed. She didn't wait for them to move. She moved first. She lunged for a stone by the riverbank, big, heavy, and hurled it with all the strength she had. Not at the man, at the mule behind him. The rock smacked against the animal's flank. It let out a shriek and reared, twisting its lead rope. The second horse panicked and reared too. Dust erupted, shouting filled the canyon. "She's crazy," one of the riders yelled. "She's gone native." "Cole, let's go." "No," the leader growled. Hank Dobbs, face gone purple with rage. He yanked a revolver from his belt. Gone was the mask of the noble rescuer. What remained was pure threat. "I ain't leaving empty-handed," he spat. "She don't come, we take her." He raised the gun. Clara saw it before she could even react. A roar tore through the canyon, deep and primal, like thunder rolling down from the heavens. But Cairo didn't fire from up high. He launched himself down the scree like a lightning strike. A blur of fury and motion, he landed on the canyon floor at a dead run, planting himself between Clara and the barrel of that gun. Then, crack. The shot rang out, sharp and close. Clara's scream caught in her throat. She saw Cairo jolt, like a puppet whose strings had been severed. A mist of crimson hung in the air. But he didn't fall. Not yet. He stood tall, planted like a stone pillar in the sand. With a cry that shook the canyon, he raised his bow and loosed an arrow in one fluid motion. It struck Hank Dobbs in the shoulder, pinning him right to the saddle. The man howled in agony, dropped his gun. "Run, damn you, run!" His voice cracked, bloodied and panicked, as the other dry spur men scrambled in the dust. The sight of the towering warrior, bloodied but still standing, was more than the prospectors could take, their nerves shattered by the sheer force of his resistance. They spun their horses around and fled through the narrow pass. They didn't look back. And Clara didn't watch them go. She was already running. Cairo turned as she reached him. The fury in his eyes had vanished, replaced by a distant, clouded stare. He tried to smile, tried to speak. "You stayed," he rasped. Then his knees buckled. Clara caught him as he crumpled, but his weight pulled both of them to the ground. She cradled his head in her lap, hands flying to his chest in panic. Her fingers found the wound, high on the right side. The bullet had torn clean through, but the blood was thick, hot and flowing far too fast. It surged between her fingers like time slipping away. "No, no, no," Clara cried out, pressing both hands to the wound. Her healer's mind clashed against the rising terror in her chest. "Don't you leave me. Don't you dare leave me." Cairo reached up, hand trembling, fingers streaked with blood. He touched her face, smearing it across her cheek like war paint. It looked like a vow. "You chose," he whispered, his voice wet with pain. "My Clara." His hand slipped away. His eyes fluttered shut. And in that canyon, once a sacred refuge, Clara Hale threw back her head and screamed. A cry so raw it shook the cottonwood leaves. It wasn't the scream of a captive. It was the scream of a wife watching her world bleed out in her arms. She had passed the test. She had chosen her place. But the price of that choice lay dying against her chest. The gunshot that echoed in the canyon wasn't an ending. It was the beginning of the longest night Clara Hale would ever face. The Box Canyon's peace was shattered, its secrets spilled. Even if those prospectors didn't return, others would. The map had been drawn, in blood. Safety was gone. Clara knew they had to vanish. But Cairo could barely move. The bullet had missed his lung, but it had drained his strength. The high mesa runners wanted to ride hard for the border. But Clara stood firm, voice quivering with a fury that silenced even the council. "If he rides," she said, "he bleeds. And if he bleeds, he dies." Her jaw tightened. "We go up, we go deep, and we go slow." They carried Cairo on a stretcher made of cedar poles and buffalo hide, moving like whispers along the deadly switchbacks carved into the canyon wall. Clara stayed by his side every step of the way, wiping the cold sweat from his brow, whispering low, half a prayer, half a demand that he hold on. When they finally reached the hidden cave, high above the reach of greedy men and the sound of any pursuit, the true battle began. For 3 days, the fever raged like wildfire. Cairo burned with heat, tossing in a haze of delirium, calling out names of the dead, ghosts only he could see. Clara never left him. She was no longer a captive, no longer a woman tending a stranger's wounds with trembling hands. She was a soul fighting to keep the other half of herself alive. She used everything she knew, made poultices of yarrow and spider silk to seal the bleeding, traced water over his cracked lips with tender care. When the nightmares came, she held him down with her own small hands, anchoring him to the earth, refusing to let him drift. She slept upright, her palm pressed to his chest, terrified the moment she blinked, the heartbeat would vanish. On the 4th morning, the fever broke. Sunlight spilled into the cave, soft and golden. Clara, dozing with her cheek resting on her knees, felt the air shift. Something subtle, a rhythm changing in the silence. She looked up. Cairo was watching her, his eyes, storm gray, steady now, met hers with quiet strength. "Clara," he rasped, barely audible, but to her it rang like a symphony. She dropped beside him, tears springing free. "I'm here," she breathed. "You're safe. You made it." He tried to rise, wincing as pain lanced through him. His hand reached out, trembling, and found hers. But instead of pulling her close, he gently pushed her hand away. "You have to leave," he said, voice thick with sorrow. "The secret's out. Soldiers will come. Prospectors, too. I can't protect you here anymore." There was something in his eyes, dignity wrapped in heartbreak. He was trying to do what he thought was right, trying to free the bird before the cage closed around them both. Clara looked at him, really looked, at the scars across his chest, at the man who had taken a bullet for her without hesitation. She thought of the life she'd left behind. Safe, maybe, but hollow. Like living inside a coffin with the lid half shut. She didn't speak, didn't argue. Instead, with deliberate grace, she leaned down. Her hands framed his face, fingertips grazing the rough stubble of his jaw, feeling the heat still lingering in his skin. And she kissed him, not quick, not shy. A kiss that carried all the words they'd never spoken. A kiss that held the silence of months and the promise of what came next. Months of longing, months of fear. All of it poured into that kiss. It tasted of sagebrush and survival. It started soft, a question, then deepened into something more. An answer? When Clara finally pulled back, Cairo stared up at her, stunned, his storm-gray eyes wide, vulnerable in a way she had never seen. "You're a fool," he murmured, though his hand had already slid behind her neck, refusing to let her go. "No," Clara whispered, her brow resting against his. "I'm finally sure. There's no safety with me," he warned quietly. "Only wind and mountain. I don't want safety," she said, her voice trembling from the force of the truth she'd carried too long. "I want you. My home isn't a town. Cairo, my home is wherever your heart beats. And I'm not going anywhere." He stared at her for what felt like forever, searching for doubt and finding none. Then, slowly, a smile broke across his face, rare and quiet, like a winter sunrise. He pulled her against his chest, over the bandage, right where his heartbeat thudded steady and alive. "And stay," he whispered into her hair. "Stay and be my heart." The seasons turned, as they always did. The red haze of summer faded into the golden hush of autumn, and then into the snowy silence of winter. High in the mountains, far beyond the reach of roads or maps, stood a cabin, built from rough-hewn logs, sealed with clay from the riverbank. Smoke curled from the chimney into the sharp, clean air. Inside, a fire crackled. Its warmth danced across the walls. Outside, the wind howled like a wolf, clawing at the world. But the door was barred, and the family was safe. Clara sat in a pine rocking chair, worn smooth by years. She was older now. Her face was kissed by sun and weather, laugh lines etched like gentle rivers at the corners of her eyes. She hummed a song, a blend of two bloodlines, a prayer spun like thread between worlds, the rhythm of a drum beneath the echo of a hymn. In her arms, wrapped tight in thick winter furs, slept a child, small but strong. He had her nose, but his hair was raven black, thick and wild. One fist curled as he dreamed, already a fighter in sleep. The door creaked open. Snow blew in behind a man dusted in white. Cairo. He stomped his boots free of powder and set a bundle of firewood beside the hearth. He moved slower now. The silver at his temples had deepened, and there was a faint hitch in his step, a quiet reminder of the bullet that nearly stole him. But his eyes shone. He knelt beside Clara and reached out a calloused finger to touch the boy's cheek. The child stirred and sighed in his sleep. Cairo looked up at her. The storm was gone from his gaze. Only peace remained. "He grows like the pines," Cairo said softly. "He grows like his father." Clara leaned down and kissed his brow. The moment lingered. Outside, the world kept changing. Railroads crept through valleys. Wire fences cut the wild into squares. The age of the open West was closing, page by page. Back in the towns, folks still told stories about the healer from solitude, said she'd been taken by savages, said she vanished into the dust. A tragic loss to the wild. They shook their heads and pitied the woman who disappeared. But they were wrong. Clara looked at her husband. She looked at their son. She looked at the life they had carved from stone and silence. She wasn't lost. She was the only one who'd ever truly been found. As the camera pulls back, leaving the warm glow behind the cabin window, we drift over the vast and uncharted land, the high ridges and whispering canyons of the mesa. The mountains stand watch, keeping their secrets. And if you listen closely, the wind no longer weeps. It sings, not a lonely violin, but a song of freedom. And that, my friends, is the story of Clara Hale and Cairo, a tale of finding love in the unlikeliest of places and having the courage to choose it, even when the whole world said not to. Makes you wonder, doesn't it? What is home, really? Is it a place or a person? Finally, let me send my deep thanks to you. Thank you for listening. If this story has touched your heart, I invite you to stay with us to discover more true tales of the Wild West. Stories that honor resilience, tenderness, and the spirit that God placed in those who blaze the trail. Subscribe, share, leave your thoughts in the comments, and join us once again to journey across this untamed land. Thank you. Aviso legal. Disclaimer. These stories are crafted purely for entertainment and may contain imaginative additions or dramatic interpretations inspired by old frontier eras. We use AI-based resources, voice, imagery, and drafting, as part of our creative process. But every final detail is carefully reviewed and shaped by human effort to preserve emotional depth and authenticity. We strictly follow YouTube's rules regarding AI-generated content and refrain from deep fakes, altered identities, or misleading representations. All images, sounds, and related materials are lawfully obtained. Please do not reuse, modify, or distribute any portion of this content without written permission. Thank you for valuing creativity, respect, and original work.